The gates of Rockford Prison creaked open, releasing a man who had spent the last 10 years of his life behind bars. Ray Callahan, 43, a former mechanic and resident of the quiet town of Pine Ridge, squinted at the bright spring sun, which was shining on his face for the first time without the shadow of prison bars. "You're free to go, Callahan," said the guard, handing Ray a worn plastic bag containing his personal belongings, a watch that had stopped 10 years ago, a wallet with faded photographs, and a wedding ring he would never wear again. Ray nodded silently. Over the years in prison, he had learned to be economical with his words. He no longer had them in abundance, nor did he have much time. 10 years. 10 years for a crime he did not commit. 10 years that Elizabeth, his ex-wife, had spent in freedom while he rotted in a cell the size of a closet. His release was not the result of a sudden bout of justice or remorse on the part of the system. Thanks to the work of the Innocence Project, which took up his case 3 years ago, and new DNA technology, the evidence at the crime scene was re-examined. The results categorically ruled Ray out as a suspect. However, the system moved slowly. It took 3 years to turn scientific facts into a court decision. "Anyone picking you up?" asked the guard, watching Ray stand uncertainly at the gate, as if tied by an invisible chain to the place he so desperately wanted to leave. "No," Ray replied curtly. There was no one waiting for him. His parents had died before he was imprisoned, his friends had disappeared as if they had never existed, and Elizabeth was the reason he was in prison. A battered bus was waiting for him in the prison parking lot to take him to Pine Ridge, the town he once called home, the town that had betrayed him. On the way, Ray looked out the window at the changing landscape. In 10 years, the world had changed. New buildings, new roads, new billboards, people with phones that looked thinner than credit cards. But Ray suspected that Pine Ridge had remained the same. Small towns change slowly, just like the people who live in them. As the bus approached the familiar outskirts of Pine Ridge, Ray felt a strange mixture of homesickness and deep disgust. Every turn of the road brought back memories. The gas station where he bought coffee every morning before work, the intersection where he kissed Elizabeth for the first time after the school dance, the auto repair shop where he worked for 15 years before his life fell apart. The bus stopped in the town square. Ray got out, clutching his plastic bag, and looked around. The town seemed smaller than he remembered, but it was mostly the same. The same storefronts, the same town hall, the same statue of the town's founder in the center of the square. In a cafe across from the bus stop, an elderly waitress was cleaning the window. She noticed Ray, and her hand froze mid-motion. Even after 10 years, even with graying temples and deep wrinkles around her eyes, she recognized him. Ray saw how her face changed, from indifference to recognition, from recognition to fear. She hurried away from the window. The first reaction? The first sign that his return would not be easy. "Mr. Callahan?" Ray turned at the voice. Standing before him was a woman in her 30s with a notepad in her hand and a determined expression on her face. "I'm Sarah Marshall from the Pine Ridge Gazette. I'm writing an article about your case and would like to—" "No comment," Ray said curtly, heading away from the square. "Please, Mr. Callahan," Sarah followed him. "I've been researching your case. I believe you were framed. I want to help you tell your story." Ray stopped and looked at her. 10 years ago, the local newspaper had torn him to pieces, publishing every sordid detail of his allegedly violent nature, portraying him as a monster capable of murder. "Why now?" he asked. "Why not 10 years ago, when it could have made a difference?" Sarah didn't look away. "Because 10 years ago, I was a college student. Because sometimes the truth takes time. Because I believe in justice." Ray smiled dryly, without humor. "Justice. I spent 10 years in prison for a murder I didn't commit. Where was justice all that time?" "That's exactly what I want to write about," Sarah replied. "About injustice, about the system that failed you, about the town that was too quick to judge you." Ray studied her face, looking for signs of lies or manipulation. He had learned to read people in prison. It was a survival skill. Sarah seemed sincere, but he no longer trusted his instincts. "I don't have time for interviews," he said finally. "I have unfinished business." "What business, Mr. Callahan?" Sarah asked, not giving up. Ray looked toward the hill where the large Victorian house stood, the house that had once belonged to him and Elizabeth. "Personal," he replied curtly. "Are you going to meet your ex-wife?" At the mention of Elizabeth, Ray's face became impenetrable. "Where can I find a cheap motel?" he asked, changing the subject. Sarah pointed toward the outskirts of town. "The Pine Haven on Elm Street. Nothing fancy, but clean and inexpensive." Ray nodded his thanks and headed in the direction she had indicated. "Mr. Callahan," Sarah called after him. "If you change your mind about the interview, here's my card. And be careful. Not everyone in this town is happy to see you back." Ray took the card without looking at it and continued on his way. He knew his return would cause a stir. He was counting on it. The Pine Tree Inn was exactly as Sarah had described it. A simple, nondescript motel with a cracked neon sign. But Ray didn't care. After a prison cell, even the most modest room seemed like a suite. The elderly clerk at the front desk studied his release ID for a long time. "Callahan, are you the Callahan?" Ray silently handed over a week's worth of money. The clerk reluctantly handed him the key to a room at the far end of the motel. Once he was alone in the room, Ray finally allowed himself to breathe. He put his meager belongings on the bed and walked over to the window. From there, he could see the city center, and if he looked closely, the roof of the house on the hill. Ray took a folded newspaper clipping out of his pocket, the only thing he had kept from his past life. It was a photograph of Elizabeth at a charity event, dated last year. He had smoothed out the clipping so many times that the paper was now as thin as tissue. Elizabeth looked almost the same as he remembered her, the same chestnut hair, the same expressive eyes, the same smile that had once made his heart beat faster. But now that smile only brought him grief. He didn't know exactly how Elizabeth had been involved in his imprisonment, but he was sure she had played a key role. Her testimony in court, her stories about his supposedly volatile temper, her concerns about his mental stability, all of it had swayed the jury against him. And then she disappeared from his life as if he had never existed. Not a single visit in 10 years. Not a single letter. Only divorce papers, which arrived in the second year of his imprisonment. Ray pinned the clipping to the bathroom mirror and looked at his reflection next to Elizabeth's image. Time had changed him more than it had changed her. Gray hair, wrinkles around his eyes, a hard line around his mouth that hadn't been there before. Prison had aged him. He hadn't come to Pine Ridge just to clear his name. He had come back to finally learn the truth. Who had really killed Jason Wright, Ray's neighbor and colleague, whose body had been found in the woods outside town with signs of a brutal beating? Why did all the evidence point to Ray? And most importantly, what role did Elizabeth play in all this? Ray lay down on his bed and closed his eyes. Tomorrow he would begin his own investigation. Tomorrow he would take the first step toward the truth and toward justice. Meanwhile, in another part of town at Pine Ridge Clinic, Elizabeth Callahan, now known as Elizabeth Foster, drops a tray of instruments when a fellow nurse casually mentions, "Did you hear? Ray Callahan's back in town. He's been released." The color drains from Elizabeth's face, and she leans against the wall to keep from falling. "What? When?" "This afternoon. My husband saw him get off the bus in the main square. They say he was acquitted thanks to some new evidence." Elizabeth mechanically picks up the scattered tools, but her hands are shaking so badly that she drops them again. "Are you okay, Liz? You look like you've seen a ghost." I'm just surprised," Elizabeth manages to say. "I didn't expect him to ever come back." A whirlwind of thoughts races through her mind. Ray is here. Ray is free. After everything that happened, after all these years, what does he want? Is he looking for answers or revenge? With trembling fingers, Elizabeth takes out her phone and quickly dials a number. "Michael, I need you to come home. Right now. Ray is back." The morning in Pine Ridge began as usual, with fog rolling in over the river and enveloping the lower part of the town in a damp haze. By 7 o'clock, most of the residents were already up and about. Stores were opening, people were rushing to work, and city life was settling into its usual rhythm. But for Ray Callahan, this morning was not like any other. For the first time in 10 years, he woke up a free man in the town he once called home. Ray got out of bed, feeling every one of his 43 years. He had kept himself in shape in prison, It was a way to stay sane, but the years of incarceration had taken their toll. The knee he had injured in a fight during his second year in prison ached in the mornings. The scar on his left cheek, a reminder of his introduction to the prison hierarchy, had become more prominent with age. Ray looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, his gaze meeting that of a newspaper clipping, a smiling Elizabeth. "See you soon," he said to the empty room. After a meager breakfast at a cafe across the street, where the waitress studiously avoided looking him in the eye, Ray headed downtown. His first stop was the Pine Ridge Public Library, an old stone building with columns that looked too grand for such a small town. Ray had never been a frequent visitor to the library before his imprisonment, but in prison he had found solace in books. Now, however, he didn't need books. He needed information, local newspaper clippings that could help him piece together the last 10 years of the town's life, and in particular, Elizabeth's. The librarian, Mrs. Parker, flinched when he approached the counter. "Hello, Mrs. Parker," Ray said quietly. "Glad to see you're still here." The woman nervously adjusted her glasses. "Ray, I heard you were back. News travels fast. It's a small town." Ray nodded. "I need the Pine Ridge Gazette for the last 10 years, and access to a computer if possible." Mrs. Parker hesitated, but professional duty prevailed over personal prejudice. "The archives are in the basement. The computers are in the reading room. You'll need a library card." "I had one," Ray said, adding with a bitter smile, "but it expired 10 years ago." Half an hour later, Ray was sitting in the library basement, surrounded by bound newspapers. He methodically looked through the issues, starting from the day of his arrest. The newspapers didn't skimp on the details. Local mechanic accused of brutal murder. Kelly to stand trial. Jury finds guilty. Life imprisonment for Pine Ridge killer. The old headlines filled him with a dull rage, but Ray kept reading, jotting down notes in a small notebook he had bought on the way. He noted names, dates, events, anything that might be useful in his investigation. Among the articles about his case, he found references to Elizabeth. At first, she was referred to as the heartbroken widow, although it was not him but the victim, Jason Wright, who was being described. Then as the ex-wife of a convicted murderer. Later, the references became less frequent and were linked to her work at the clinic and her charitable activities. And then, in an issue from 5 years ago, he found what he was looking for. Wedding of the Year, Elizabeth Kelly and Michael Foster tie the knot. The photo showed a radiant Elizabeth in a wedding dress, next to a tall man with a neat beard and piercing eyes, Michael Foster. The name seemed familiar, but Ray couldn't remember where he had heard it before. He made a note to check it out later. After several hours of working with the archives, Ray moved on to the computers. The internet had changed in the 10 years he had been incarcerated, but the basic principles remained the same. He searched for information about Michael Foster and soon found that he was a respected lawyer, a partner in a small law firm called Foster & Green, specializing in civil law. Ray also found several articles about his own case written by Sarah Marshall over the past 2 years. She did seem genuinely interested in restoring justice, asking tough questions about the original investigation. Finishing his research, Ray left the library in the drizzling rain. He decided to walk despite the weather. He needed to think, and walking always helped him organize his thoughts. Without fully realizing where he was going, Ray found himself in front of the old Wright & Sons auto repair shop where he had worked before his arrest. The shop was still in business, but the sign had changed to Donovan's Auto Service. Ray stood in the rain, staring at the building, when he heard a voice behind him. "Back for a trip down memory lane, Callahan?" Ray turned and saw Sheriff David Holt. Holt was no longer young, around 60, with graying hair and wrinkles of experience on his face. He had been the sheriff of Pine Ridge for 15 years and had personally led the investigation into Jason Wright's murder. "Sheriff," Ray nodded, "I heard you were back. I can't say it's a good idea. This is a free country." "True, but some people around here still remember what happened to Jason." "And I remember too," Ray replied, looking the sheriff straight in the eye. "I remember being sent to prison for a murder I didn't commit." Holt sighed. "The court decided otherwise. The court was wrong, just like you, Sheriff." Look, Callahan, I was just doing my job. The evidence pointed to you. The evidence was fabricated. The sheriff grimaced. That's a serious accusation. No more serious than the one they accused me of. They stood silently in the rain, studying each other. Finally, Holt said, "What do you want, Callahan? Why did you come back?" "I want the truth." "The truth doesn't always bring peace. I don't want peace. I want justice." The sheriff nodded, as if that was the answer he expected. "Just don't cause any trouble, understand? Enough people have suffered already." With that, he walked to his patrol car, leaving Ray standing in the rain. Ray watched the car drive away, thinking about the sheriff's words. Holt seemed concerned, maybe even a little guilty. Maybe he really believed he had done the right thing 10 years ago. Or maybe he had his own reasons for wanting Ray to stay behind bars. Cold and wet, Ray decided to return to the motel. On the way, he stopped at a small grocery store to buy a few essentials. When he approached the cash register, the clerk, a young woman he didn't recognize, suddenly turned pale. You're Ray Callahan," she breathed. Ray nodded wearily. "Yes. My father worked with Jason Wright. He said you—" "I didn't kill Jason," Ray said quietly but firmly. "I was wrongfully convicted and now I'm innocent. You can check the court records." The girl's face showed her doubt, but she silently rang up his purchases. As Ray was heading for the exit, she said unexpectedly, "My father always thought something wasn't right about this case. He said you didn't look like a murderer." Ray stopped. "What's your father's name?" "Tom Donovan. He bought the auto repair shop after it closed. Tell him I'd like to talk to him, if he doesn't mind." The girl hesitated, but then nodded. "I'll tell him." As he left the store, Ray felt a faint spark of hope. Perhaps not everyone in town was convinced of his guilt. Perhaps there were people who could help him find the truth. Back at the motel, Ray took a hot shower, trying to warm up. When he got out of the bathroom, he noticed that the indicator on his cheap phone was flashing. He had a message. The number was unfamiliar. "Mr. Callahan, this is Sarah Marshall. I've gained access to some of your case files. I think you should see this. Can we meet at Jenny's Cafe tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Ray considered the offer. He still wasn't sure he could trust a journalist, but she seemed genuinely willing to help, and he needed allies in this town. "I'll be there," he replied briefly. Ray spent the rest of the day reviewing his notes and trying to come up with a plan of action. He drew a kind of diagram on a piece of paper, connecting names and events, trying to see the big picture. At the center of the diagram was the name Jason Wright, the victim, his former neighbor and colleague. Next to him were Elizabeth and Michael Foster. Was there a connection between them before the murder? That question kept Ray awake. When evening came, Ray felt he couldn't stay inside any longer. He needed some fresh air and maybe a drink. The only bar in town was the Pine Bar, a nondescript establishment on the outskirts where the locals gathered after work. Ray knew his appearance there would cause a reaction, but he needed to start interacting with the town again. He couldn't hide forever. The bar was full when Ray walked in. The muffled hum of conversation and country music from an old jukebox created a familiar atmosphere. For a moment, Ray felt as if the last 10 years had never happened, but then the conversations died down. Heads turned in his direction. Some faces expressed shock, others undisguised hostility. Ray walked calmly to the bar and sat down on a free stool. "Whiskey. Double," he said to the bartender, who, to his surprise, turned out to be familiar. Jack Murphy, a former regular customer at the auto repair shop. Jack hesitated only a moment before pouring the drink. "On the house," he said quietly. "Welcome back, Ray." The small gesture of hospitality was unexpected. Ray nodded his thanks and took a sip, enjoying the burn of alcohol, his first in 10 years. Gradually, the noise in the bar resumed, although Ray felt eyes on him. He drank his whiskey slowly, studying the reflections of the patrons in the mirror behind the bar. And then he saw her, Elizabeth. She was sitting in the far corner of the bar with a man whom Ray recognized from photographs as Michael Foster. They were engrossed in conversation and didn't seem to notice him. Ray froze, unable to take his eyes off the woman who had once been the center of his life. She had changed less than he expected, the same chestnut hair, the same profile. But there was something new about her, a confidence, an elegance that hadn't been there before. At that moment, Elizabeth looked up and caught his gaze across the bar. Her face paled, and the hand holding her glass froze halfway to her lips. Time seemed to stand still as they stared at each other across the noisy bar. 10 years had separated them. 10 years of pain, loneliness, and rage on Ray's part. Michael, noticing the change in his wife's behavior, turned to see what had caught her attention. His eyes narrowed when he saw Ray. He said something to Elizabeth, placing his hand on her shoulder in a protective gesture. Ray turned away first, finished his whiskey, and put the glass on the bar. He hadn't planned on running into Elizabeth so soon, but maybe it was for the best. Now she knew he wasn't back just for fun. He wanted her to be nervous. He wanted her to be afraid. Ray put the money on the bar, ignoring Jack's offer, and headed for the exit. As he passed Elizabeth and Michael's table, he slowed down. For a moment, their eyes met again. "Ray," Elizabeth said softly. "Elizabeth," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "Michael," he nodded to the man, letting him know he knew who he was. "Callahan," Michael nodded tensely in response. "I heard about your release." "Acquittal," Ray corrected. "I was innocent. Always have been." "What are you doing in Pine Ridge?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. Ray allowed himself a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Visiting old friends. Re-establishing old ties. We need to talk, don't we, Liz?" Before she could answer, he turned and walked out of the bar into the night. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Seeing Elizabeth had stirred up old memories, both good and bad. He remembered their first meeting in high school, their wedding in her parents' backyard, their dreams for the future. And then, he remembered her face in the courtroom as she testified against him, her words about his scary outbursts of anger, about how she had always been afraid that one day he would lose control. Lies. It was all lies. But why? What made the woman he loved betray him like that? The answer, Ray was sure, had something to do with Jason Wright's murder, and he intended to find that answer no matter how bitter the truth might be. Returning to the motel, Ray noticed that the door to his room was slightly ajar. He froze, tense. He hadn't left the door open. Careful, ready for possible danger, Ray pushed the door open and entered the room. At first glance, everything was as it had been before. But then he noticed that his notes, left on the table, had been mixed up. Someone had been rummaging through his things. There was an envelope on the bed that hadn't been there before. No address, no stamp. Ray opened it and took out a folded piece of paper. It had a short text printed on it. "Leave the past in the past. For your own good." Ray crumpled up the note. Someone wanted to scare him, to make him leave. This only strengthened his resolve to stay and get to the bottom of things. He carefully inspected the room, making sure that nothing else had been changed and that there were no other surprises left. Then he checked the windows and doors to make sure they were securely locked. Lying in the dark, Ray reflected on the events of the day. The meeting with the sheriff, who seemed wary. The small spark of hope from Tom Donovan's daughter. The confrontation with Elizabeth and Michael. And now this warning. Someone in Pine Ridge didn't want the truth to come out. Someone was afraid of what Ray might uncover, and that only convinced him that he was on the right track. Tomorrow's meeting with Sarah Marshall could be the first step toward solving the mystery that had cost him 10 years of his life. Ray closed his eyes, but sleep was slow in coming. In the elegant house on the hill, Elizabeth Foster sat on the edge of her bed, staring blindly into the darkness while her husband slept beside her. Meeting Ray had shaken her more than she had expected. To see him again after all these years, to see the pain and rage in his eyes. Elizabeth stood up and went to the window, looking at the lights of the city below. Somewhere out there was Ray, perhaps plotting his revenge. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to suppress the trembling. There were things Ray didn't know, secrets that had to remain buried, for the good of all concerned. But Elizabeth knew Ray. Once he made up his mind, he didn't back down. He would dig until he found the truth. And when that happened, Elizabeth shuddered at the thought of the consequences. Some mistakes could not be undone. Some sins cannot be atoned for. "Are you okay?" Michael's voice from the darkness of the bedroom made her flinch. Yes, she lied. I just can't sleep. Because of him? Michael's voice was tense. We have to do something, Michael. He's not going to leave just like that. I'll take care of it, Michael promised. Don't worry. He can't hurt us. Elizabeth looked back at the city lights, unsure who was really in greater danger, them from Ray or Ray from the truth he was so desperate to find. The morning was clear, which was rare for Pine Ridge at this time of year. Ray sat by the window at Jenny's cafe, waiting for Sarah Marshall. He had arrived half an hour early, a habit developed over years in prison, where punctuality was part of survival. Sarah arrived at 10 sharp, with a leather bag slung over her shoulder and a determined look on her face. Seeing Ray, she headed straight for his table. Thanks for coming, she said, sitting down across from him. You said you had something for me, Ray replied, not wasting time on pleasantries. Sarah nodded and took a folder out of her bag. Copies of some documents related to your case. It took me 2 years of legal battles to get access to them. Ray opened the folder. Inside were copies of police reports, interrogation transcripts, and, most importantly, photos from the crime scene that he had never seen before. How did you get these? He asked, flipping through the documents. A journalist has her sources, Sarah replied evasively. But what's important is what you see. Ray studied the photos of the place where Jason Wright's body had been found, a clearing in the woods, signs of a struggle, blood on fallen leaves. Then something caught his eye. In one of the photos taken from a wider angle, he could see the edge of a parking lot next to the woods. And in that parking lot was part of a car that Ray recognized. Is that Michael Foster's car? He asked, pointing to the photo. Sarah leaned closer. I'm not sure. It could be a coincidence. Foster was a lawyer. What was he doing near the murder scene? Maybe it's not his car, Sarah said, but I can check the registration. Ray continued to look through the documents. Jason's autopsy report showed that death was caused by multiple blows to the head with a blunt object. The murder weapon had never been found, but experts speculated that it could have been a mechanical tool, possibly a crowbar. Here, take a look at this. Sarah pointed to a page in the medical examiner's report. It mentions fibers found under the victim's fingernails. They didn't match your clothes, but for some reason, this information wasn't mentioned in court. Ray felt anger rising inside him. Because they had already decided I was guilty. Exactly, Sarah nodded. The entire investigation was focused on gathering evidence against you, ignoring anything that might point to another suspect. Why are you helping me? Ray asked suddenly. What's in it for you? Sarah paused, as if weighing how much she could say. I grew up believing in justice. My father was a lawyer. He defended people he believed were innocent, even when it was unpopular. And also, she paused. I knew Elizabeth in college. We weren't close friends, but I knew her well enough to be surprised when I heard her testimony at your trial. This new information intrigued Ray. What surprised you? The way she described you. It didn't match what she had said about you before. In college, she always spoke warmly of you, about how you supported her dream of becoming a nurse, how you worked extra shifts to help pay for her tuition. Ray turned away, suddenly feeling a lump in his throat. Those memories still hurt. And also, Sarah continued, I managed to find a witness who wasn't interviewed during the original investigation. A homeless man named Frank Corey. He often slept in the woods near the murder site, and he claims he saw Michael Foster there on the night of the murder. Ray turned sharply toward her. Is he sure? Yes. He was close enough to see his face. The problem is, no one wanted to listen to a homeless alcoholic 10 years ago. Where is this witness now? That's the problem. I can't find him. He disappeared about a week ago, right after I interviewed him for the article I'm working on. This information made Ray wary. Do you think it's related? Sarah shrugged. I don't know. Frank isn't exactly stable. He could have just gone somewhere, but the coincidence is alarming. They continued discussing the details of the case when the bell above the cafe door rang, attracting their attention. Michael Foster himself entered the cafe. Ray and Sarah fell silent, watching as Foster approached the counter, ordered a coffee, and turned to notice them. For a moment, his face betrayed his surprise, but he quickly regained his composure and, after receiving his order, headed straight for their table. Miss Marshall, he nodded to Sarah. Callahan, I didn't expect to see you here together. It's a small town, Mr. Foster, Sarah replied with a professional smile. It's hard not to run into each other. Indeed, Foster agreed, his gaze shifting to the open folder on the table. Interesting reading? Ray calmly closed the folder. Very. A tension hung between the men, almost palpable in the air. Ray said you saw each other yesterday at the Pine Bar, Sarah interjected, trying to lighten the mood. Yes, an unexpected encounter, Foster said. Elizabeth was surprised. I'm sure she was, Ray replied. As was I when I found out about your marriage. Foster paused, then said, Look, Callahan, I understand you've been through hell, but that was 10 years ago. Elizabeth has built a new life. We've built a new life. On the ruins of mine, Ray said quietly. No one wanted it to turn out this way, Foster said, clearly trying to be diplomatic. The system isn't perfect. Mistakes happen. It wasn't a mistake, Ray said, looking Foster straight in the eye. Someone worked very hard to put me in prison, and I want to know who and why. Foster finished his coffee and put the cup on the table. The past is best left in the past, Callahan. For your own good. Those words, echoing the warning in the note, made Ray tense. Interesting way of putting it, he remarked. Foster nodded goodbye and left the cafe, leaving the tension hanging in the air. He knows more than he's saying, Sarah said as the door closed behind the lawyer. Everyone in this town has something to hide, Ray replied. After meeting with Sarah, Ray decided to find Tom Donovan, the father of the girl from the store who, according to her, had doubts about his guilt. Donovan's auto service was where Ray used to work with Jason Wright. When Ray entered the garage, the smell of motor oil and rubber brought back a flood of memories. Little had changed here. The same lifts, the same tools, even the calendar with half-naked models on the wall, albeit from a different year. An elderly man in oil-stained overalls peered out from under the raised hood of a Ford. Can I help you? He asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Then he recognized the visitor, and his eyes widened. Callahan? Holy shit! Hello, Tom, Ray said. Long time no see. Tom Donovan was one of the few mechanics who had always treated Ray with respect. They weren't close friends, but there was a professional respect between them. I heard you were back, Tom said, wiping his hands. You ran into my Jenny at the store, huh? Ray nodded. She said you always doubted I was guilty. Tom looked around to make sure they were alone, then nodded toward a small office in the back of the shop. Let's talk in there. In the cramped office, littered with bills and spare parts catalogs, Tom offered Ray coffee from an old pot that always sat on the radiator. Listen, Ray, Tom began as they sat down. I never believed you killed Jason. I knew you both too well. Why didn't you say anything at the trial? I tried, Tom sighed. But the prosecutor dismissed me as a witness. He said my testimony was irrelevant because I wasn't a witness to the crime and couldn't confirm your alibi. What about Sheriff Holt? Did he conduct a thorough investigation? Tom grimaced. Holt. He's a good man, but... Look, he was under a lot of pressure at the time. Jason's wife was in the last months of her pregnancy. The press was hounding him. Everyone wanted someone to be found guilty, and all the evidence pointed to you. Fabricated evidence, Ray remarked. Possibly, Tom said cautiously. But there's something you need to know. Shortly before his death, Jason and Michael Foster had an argument, right here in the workshop. Ray leaned forward. What was it about? I don't know exactly. Jason was repairing Foster's car. Something with the engine. They were talking loudly, but I couldn't make out the words over the noise of the equipment. Then Foster left, angry as hell. When was that? A couple of days before the murder. Another clue linking Michael Foster to Jason. Ray mentally added it to his growing diagram. What about Elizabeth? Was she here often at that time? Tom hesitated. Look, Ray, I don't want to stir up old trouble. I need the truth, Tom. Tom sighed. Yeah, she came by sometimes, usually to pick you up after work. But a couple of times I saw her talking to Jason when you weren't there. Were they close? I can't say, just talking. Maybe just neighbors. Ray pondered the information he had received. The connections were slowly beginning to emerge. Elizabeth, Jason, Michael Foster. But what exactly linked them and how it led to his imprisonment was still a mystery. "Thanks, Tom," Ray said, finishing his coffee. "You're the only one in this town who'll talk to me openly. I've always thought you were a good mechanic and a good man, Callahan, and I'm glad the truth is finally coming out." As Ray was leaving the shop, a young mechanic he didn't know approached him. "Hey, you're Callahan, right?" the guy asked, looking around nervously. "My aunt is a nurse at the clinic. She works with Mrs. Foster. She asked me to tell you that Elizabeth wants to see you tonight at the cemetery chapel." "The chapel?" Ray asked, surprised by the choice of location. "Yes, at 8 o'clock. She said it was important and that she'd be alone." The guy hurried back to work, leaving Ray to ponder this unexpected message. Was this invitation a trap? Or did Elizabeth really want to meet him alone to tell him the truth? Either way, it was a chance Ray couldn't pass up. That evening, as dusk fell on Pine Ridge, Ray headed for the Old Town Cemetery. A small stone chapel built over a century ago stood at the entrance, a silent guardian of the dead. Ray was on his guard, expecting an ambush, but all was quiet. Only the rustling of leaves and the distant barking of a dog broke the silence. The chapel door was ajar, and a soft light burned inside. Ray cautiously entered. Elizabeth was sitting on one of the benches, nervously clasping her hands. Hearing his footsteps, she turned abruptly, and her face betrayed her relief. "You came," she said quietly. "You wanted to see me," Ray replied, keeping his distance. Elizabeth looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes. "Ray, I have something to tell you, about what happened 10 years ago." "I'm listening." "It's much more complicated than you think," she began. "Jason, he wasn't who he said he was, and Michael, he's involved too, but not in the way you think." "Explain," Ray demanded, feeling that he was finally getting closer to the truth. "I can't tell you everything right now, but I have proof, documents that will explain everything." "Where are they?" "Not here. They're hidden in a safe place. I'll bring them tomorrow night." Ray looked at her suspiciously. "Why should I believe you, after everything that's happened?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "Because I never stopped loving you, Ray. Even when I testified against you. Especially then." Before Ray could respond, they heard the sound of a car approaching. Elizabeth jumped up. "It's Michael! He mustn't know we met." "Elizabeth, wait. Tomorrow, at 8 o'clock in the evening, at the old house by the lake." She whispered quickly and rushed to the back door of the chapel. Ray was left alone, confused and filled with questions. A minute later, he heard the car pull away and drive off. Maybe it wasn't Michael, but someone else? Stepping out of the chapel, Ray noticed Sheriff Holt standing by his patrol car. "Evening prayers, Callahan?" the sheriff asked with a slight smile. "Just visiting old friends," Ray replied, nodding toward the cemetery. "Strange place for a meeting. Some meetings can't happen anywhere else." The sheriff studied his face closely. "You're looking for something in Pine Ridge, and I want to know what it is." "The truth," Ray replied simply. "The truth is rarely what we want it to be," Holt remarked philosophically. "Be careful in your search, Callahan. Not all secrets are worth uncovering." With that, the sheriff got into his car and drove away, leaving Ray to ponder the strange encounter and the even stranger warning. It seemed as if the whole town wanted him to leave the past alone. But the more he was warned, the stronger his determination to learn the truth became. And that truth, it seemed, might be more shocking than he had imagined. The old house by the lake greeted Ray with creaking floorboards and the smell of dampness. This summer cottage, once owned by Elizabeth's parents, had been abandoned for years. The rays of the setting sun shone through the dusty windows, creating strange shadows. Ray looked around before entering. There was no sign of Elizabeth or anyone else. After spending 10 years in prison, he had learned to be cautious. In his jacket pocket, he felt the small voice recorder Sarah had lent him. "Record everything she says," the journalist had advised. It was almost 8 o'clock in the evening. Elizabeth should have been there any minute. Ray paced the room, memories flooding back. This was where he and Elizabeth had spent their first summer after their wedding, where they had made plans for a future that was never to be. The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted his thoughts. The door opened, and Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, wearing a dark coat with a large bag slung over her shoulder. "You came," she said, her voice tinged with surprise, as if she wasn't sure he would respond to her invitation. "You mentioned evidence," Ray reminded her, keeping his distance. Elizabeth nodded, closed the door, and walked over to the old table. She took a thick folder out of her bag. "This is everything I have. Documents, photographs, letters. They will explain a lot." Ray took the folder and opened it. On top was a photograph of Jason Wright and Michael Foster shaking hands at some kind of official event. They knew each other before. "They were partners," Elizabeth interrupted. "Not just acquaintances, business partners, and not entirely legal." Ray leafed through the documents. Bank statements, contracts with strange wording, photos of meetings. "Money laundering?" he guessed. "Yes, Jason used the auto repair shop. Michael provided legal cover. It went on for years." "And you? What was your role?" Elizabeth turned away, looking out the window at the darkening lake. "I found out by accident. I found the documents in Jason's things when I picked up your jacket from the repair shop. He noticed, and he started threatening me." "How exactly?" "You," her voice trembled. "He said that if I said anything, he'd frame you so badly that you'd never get out of prison. I didn't take the threat seriously, and then he was found dead, and they framed me," Ray finished. "I didn't know it would turn out like this. I swear." Her voice was filled with despair. "When you were arrested, Michael came to see me. He said he and Jason had had a falling out, that Jason had threatened to turn them both in. Michael insisted he didn't kill him, that it was an accident during a fight." "And you believed him?" "I didn't know what to believe. Michael said he could help you if I cooperated, but instead, you testified against me." Elizabeth covered her face with her hands. "He manipulated me. He said that if I didn't give the testimony he had prepared, you would face the death penalty. That at least you would stay alive." I was scared and confused. Ray felt a wave of anger rising inside him. 10 years, Elizabeth. 10 years of my life. "I know, and I live with that guilt every day." "Why did you marry him?" "To be closer to the evidence, to find a way to free you." Ray smiled. "Convenient explanation." "It's the truth. Why do you think I kept those documents? Why did I collect information all these years?" Ray studied her face closely, trying to see the truth behind her words. Part of him wanted to believe her, but another part reminded him of the betrayal. "What about the witness? The homeless man Sarah found?" "Frank Corey. Michael bribed Sheriff Holt to ignore his testimony, and when Sarah started digging into the case, what happened to Frank?" "But," Elizabeth lowered her eyes. "I don't know. I'm telling you the truth. But Michael was very upset when he found out Sarah had found him." Suddenly, headlights flashed outside the window. Elizabeth shuddered. "It's Michael. He's been following me. You have to leave." "I'm not going anywhere. It's time to put an end to this." "You don't understand. He's dangerous." The front door burst open. Michael Foster stood in the doorway, his usually impeccable appearance disrupted. His tie askew, his eyes filled with rage. "I knew it," he hissed through clenched teeth. "You whore! You've been on his side this whole time?" "Michael, calm down." Elizabeth backed away. "Let's just talk." "Talk?" He laughed, but there was no joy in it. "About what? About how you betrayed me? About how you gave him the documents that could send me to prison for the rest of my life?" Ray stepped forward, blocking Elizabeth. "You killed Jason and framed me." "What does it matter? There's no proof. No one will believe a convicted murderer and his whore of a wife." "There's a witness," Ray said. "Frank Corey." Michael's face twisted for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "A homeless alcoholic? Seriously? Who's going to believe him?" "What about these documents and our conversation, which is being recorded right now?" Michael froze, then quickly pulled a gun from his jacket's inside pocket. "Give me the folder and the recording, now," Elizabeth screamed. Ray froze, assessing the situation. Michael held the gun steadily, without nervousness or trembling. He clearly knew how to use it. "Calm down, Foster. You don't need to make this worse." "Shut up. Everything was perfect until you came back. I had everything. My position, my reputation, a beautiful wife." "A wife who never loved you," Elizabeth said quietly. Those words seemed to hit Michael harder than the threat of exposure. "Shut up! You're mine! I won't let him take you away!" It all happened in a matter of seconds. Michael pointed the gun at Ray. Elizabeth rushed forward, screaming, "No!" A shot rang out. Elizabeth screamed and fell. "Elizabeth!" Ray rushed toward her, forgetting his own safety. Michael stood frozen, staring at the gun in his hand, as if unable to believe what had happened. I didn't mean to." Ray pressed his palm against Elizabeth's chest wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Call an ambulance! Now!" But Michael continued to stand in a daze. Then, as if coming to his senses, he pointed the gun at Ray. "No, this is even better. You killed her, in a fit of revenge, and then I shot you in self-defense. The perfect ending to the story." At that moment, the front door flew open again. "Police, drop your weapons!" Sheriff Holt stood in the doorway, his gun pointed at Michael. Behind him, Sarah Marshall's figure was visible. "Put the gun down, Foster," the sheriff commanded. "It's over." Michael hesitated, his gaze darting between the sheriff and Ray, who was holding Elizabeth, bleeding profusely. "I knew she would betray me," he whispered. "I knew it from the beginning." With those words, he pointed the gun at himself and pulled the trigger. The bright light of the hospital lamps hurt his eyes. Ray sat in the hallway of the intensive care unit at Pine Ridge Hospital, staring at the door behind which doctors were fighting for Elizabeth's life. His hands were still stained with her blood, even though a nurse had offered to wash them. "Coffee?" Ray looked up. Sarah Marshall was holding out a paper cup to him. He took it mechanically, unable to smell or feel the warmth. "Have the doctors said anything?" Sarah asked, sitting down next to him. "The bullet grazed her heart. They're doing everything they can," he said, his voice sounding lifeless. "She saved your life." Ray nodded. "Why were you there, you and the sheriff?" Sarah took a sip from her cup. "After we met at the cafe, I kept digging. I found bank records showing suspicious transfers between Foster's company and Wright's auto shop. I went to the sheriff." "To Holt? But he was part of this." "Not exactly. He was sloppy in his investigation, yes. He turned a blind eye to some inconsistencies. But when I showed him the documents, something in him changed," Sarah said thoughtfully, twirling her cup in her hands. "I think the realization that he had sent an innocent man to prison had been weighing on him all these years. And he just decided to help? Out of the blue? Not out of the blue, actually. Holt admitted that he started his own quiet investigation about a year ago, when the first signs appeared that something was wrong with your case. But bureaucracy is slow, and Michael was influential in the city." Sheriff Holt appeared in the hallway. He looked older than his years, with deep wrinkles on his face and the tired eyes of a man carrying a heavy burden. "Frank Corey has been found," he said as he approached them. "He's alive. Michael was holding him in an abandoned barn outside of town. He's in the hospital now, dehydrated, but his life isn't in danger." "Thank God," Sarah breathed. "What about the documents?" Ray asked. "The ones Elizabeth gave me." "They're safe. They've already been sent to the district attorney's office." Holt paused, then added, "I've filed for retirement. After all this..." The door to the ward opened and the surgeon emerged, tired but relieved. "She's stable. The operation was successful. If there are no complications, the prognosis is good." Ray felt the tension of the last few hours melt away. "Can I see her?" "Not for long. She hasn't regained consciousness after the anesthesia." The room was quiet, only the steady beeping of medical equipment breaking the silence. Elizabeth lay motionless, pale, with tubes and wires connected to her body. Ray gently took her lifeless hand. "I'm here," he whispered. "It's over." 3 weeks later, Pine Ridge was buzzing like a beehive. The story of money laundering, false accusations, and the events that followed became the main topic of not only local but also national news. Sarah Marshall's article, which told the whole story from beginning to end, was nominated for a prestigious journalism award. Elizabeth was slowly recovering, still in the hospital, but now in a regular ward. Ray visited her every day, despite the complicated feelings he was experiencing. Betrayal, anger, and bitterness did not disappear overnight. but they were joined by understanding and perhaps glimmers of forgiveness. On the day Ray entered the ward, Elizabeth was sitting in a chair by the window looking out at the city below. She turned at the sound of his footsteps and smiled faintly. "You came." "I come every day," Ray replied, sitting down beside her. "I know, it's just, I'm still amazed by it." Ray placed the latest issue of the Pine Ridge Gazette on the bedside table. "The district attorney has officially dropped all charges against me, and he's opened a posthumous case against Michael." "I'm glad," Elizabeth said quietly. "You deserve it. You deserve your life back. You can't get 10 years back." "I know," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "And I'll never forgive myself for that." They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside the window, life in Pine Ridge went on as usual. People hurried about their business, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the hospital room. "What are you going to do now?" Elizabeth finally asked. Ray shrugged. "I haven't decided yet. Maybe I'll leave here. Too many memories." "I understand. What about you?" Elizabeth looked down at her hands. "After I'm discharged, I'll have to give a statement. Then, I don't know. There's not much left for me here either." Silence fell again, but now there was something unspoken hanging between them. "You know," Ray finally said, looking out the window, "I plan to kill you." Elizabeth flinched, but didn't look surprised. "I guessed. For 10 years, all I thought about was revenge. It was the only thing that kept me alive in there. And now?" Ray looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not only the woman who had betrayed him, but also the woman who had risked her life to save him, the woman who, despite her mistakes, was trying to make things right. "Now, I just want to understand. Why did everything happen the way it did?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Jason blackmailed me. He had compromising photos. Nothing serious. Just me with an ex-boyfriend from college. But he threatened to show them to you, to say they were recent photos, to destroy our marriage. Why would he do that?" "He was afraid I would tell you about his affair with Michael. And then when he was found dead, Michael came to me. He said he had evidence against you, and if I didn't do what he said, you would be sentenced to death. And you believed him. I was scared and confused, and then it was too late to change anything. Michael watched my every move, especially after we got married." "Was it a marriage of convenience?" Elizabeth nodded. "For him, it was control over a potential witness. For me, it was to find evidence to free you, and I searched for years. But you never used it. I was afraid. I knew what Michael was capable of. And then Sarah showed up with her investigation, and everything started moving." The door opened, and Sarah Marshall entered with a bouquet of wildflowers. "Sorry to interrupt. I can come back later." "It's okay," Elizabeth smiled weakly. "Thank you for the flowers." "I have some good news," Sarah said, placing the bouquet in a vase. "Frank Corey has given an official statement. He confirmed that he saw Michael Foster at the murder scene that night. That won't give me back 10 years, Ray remarked. "No," Sarah agreed. "But there's more news. The lawyer from the Innocence Project contacted me. They're preparing a lawsuit against the state for wrongful imprisonment. With the evidence we have, the chances of success are very high." Ray nodded, although money was the last thing on his mind. "Thanks. And one more thing." Sarah hesitated. "Sheriff Holt asked me to tell you that he wants to see you. In person. He said he has something to explain." The next day, Ray met Holt in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. The sheriff was no longer in uniform, dressed in civilian clothes, worn jeans and a plaid shirt. "I owe you an apology, Callahan," Holt began without preamble. "I screwed up your case. Were you bribed?" "No, worse. I was lazy and arrogant. The evidence pointed to you. Your wife testified against you. It was convenient for me to close the case quickly." "And the witness? Frank Corey? I thought he was just looking for attention. A homeless alcoholic telling wild stories. I've seen plenty of those in my career. I didn't even check his story. It's unforgivable." Holt looked genuinely remorseful, which softened Ray a little. "It doesn't matter now." "It does. It does to me," Holt said firmly. "I let you down. I let my badge down. I let the whole town down. and I'll never be able to make up for it completely. A month after Elizabeth was discharged from the hospital, when the first snow covered Pine Ridge with a white blanket, Ray finally made up his mind. He sold his story to a major publisher, receiving an advance that would be enough for a new start somewhere far away from Pine Ridge. On the day of his departure, he stood at Michael Foster's grave in the town cemetery, not out of respect or grief, but simply to make sure that the nightmare was truly over. "I thought I'd find you here." Elizabeth's voice made him turn around. She looked better, still thin and pale, but with a glimmer of life in her eyes. "I'm leaving today," Ray said. "I know. Sarah told me." "What about you? What are you going to do?" "Start over, somewhere where no one knows my story." Ray nodded, understanding her desire. "You deserve a second chance." "So do you," she said quietly. They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking at the snow-covered grave of the man who had destroyed their lives. "I'll never forgive you completely," Ray finally said, "but I understand why you did what you did." "I know," she said, her voice filled with humility. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, just understanding." Ray turned to leave. Stopping, he said without looking back, "Take care of yourself, Elizabeth. You too, Ray." He walked through the snow-covered cemetery, feeling the weight of the past 10 years gradually lift with each step. Ahead of him lay a new life, uncertain, unpredictable, but free from the ghosts of the past. And in the center of Pine Ridge, Sarah Marshall was finishing her final article on the Ray Callahan case. She called it "Justice Late, but Inevitable," a story of betrayal, lost years, and the truth that, no matter what, always finds a way to the surface.